this very important briefing on lifting the curtain on U.S. drug pricing distortion. You will hear from my co-chair for We Work for Health, President and CEO of the Healthcare Institute of New Jersey, Dean Paranikis, a little later in the program. Meanwhile, BioNJ has the pleasure of working with organizations such as We Work for Health New Jersey and Hinge in our efforts to ensure that New Jersey is a robust life sciences ecosystem where innovation is unencumbered and then patients can access that innovation. So our mission at BioNJ is to help our members help patients, as our tagline states, because patients can't wait. And I have to say that I've never been more proud of the industry's work on behalf of patients than I am today. Our industry is literally saving the world. New Jerseyans and all American consumers have long had access to the best prescription treatment options in the world. Our drug development system works in delivering our patients the newest treatments for a wide array of therapeutic areas. COVID-19 has been just a shining example of the American drug development system at work, delivering global cures with New Jersey companies such as Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Gilead, Merck, Eli Lilly, and Sanofi, as well as others, among those researching and manufacturing COVID vaccines and therapies right here in the Garden State. This commitment to biopharmaceutical research and development is one of the main reasons we can see the end of the pandemic on the horizon. For patients, the drug supply chain often feels, though, like a complex web of rebates, discounts, co-pays, and coinsurance. So this morning, we are going to hear about increasing costs at the pharmacy counter and the significant role that little-known middlemen called pharmacy benefit managers have to play in adding to these costs. To walk us through this complex process, it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker. Born and raised in almost literally a pharmacy, it sounds like, our presenter has been crawling around pharmacies his entire life. After 3 years as a pharmacy technician and 2 years of pre-pharmacy curriculum, he diverted course, graduated from Ohio State University in 2007 with dual degrees in communications and political science before moving into the world of association management. Thinking that pharmacy would be in his rearview mirror forever, he ended up making his way back to his pharmacy home, heading up government affairs for the Ohio Pharmacists Association. After years of studying the pharmacy marketplace, he became increasingly perplexed and concerned as he saw drug costs spiking while payouts to pharmacies were declining. Knowing something was being lost somewhere in the middle of an ever-growing transaction, he has spent years working to crack the drug pricing code and pull the rug out from what he believes is one of the most dysfunctional marketplaces in the world. It is my pleasure to welcome the president of 3 Axis Advisors and CEO of 46 Brooklyn Research, Antonio Chacha. Antonio, welcome. Thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I appreciate it. And I am happy and excited to talk to you about our messy and complicated prescription drug pricing marketplace. Next slide. So as Debbie said, I was with the Ohio Pharmacists Association for almost 10 years. And in the middle of 2016, pharmacies started calling me complaining about massive cuts in their reimbursement within the Medicaid managed care program in Ohio. Regardless of whether pharmacies are paid well, too much, too little, et cetera, it was a major shock. It was about a 60 to 80% cut in pharmacies' operating revenue essentially overnight. We ended up finding that as pharmacies were being paid less, the state was getting billed more. We used publicly available drug pricing data that the state and the managed care plans and the PBMs were unwilling to turn over as a mechanism to diagnose a growing tumor, if you will, in the middle of the pharmacy transaction. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the publicly available data that we used to break open what was happening in the Ohio Medicaid program is the same data that exists for states across the country. So we launched 46 Brooklyn Research as a way to take publicly available data sets that most people have no idea exist, and if they did, wouldn't know how to use, and to use that information to educate the public on how prescription drug pricing works in the United States. When we launched in 2018, we were bombarded by law firms, provider groups, state governments seeking our assistance. And so we launched a consulting firm. I never thought I would be a consultant in a million years, but there was such a pent-up demand that we launched 3 Access Advisors in 2019. We work for Medicaid fraud control units, state payers, provider groups, research firms, technology companies, law firms, investment analysts, employers, benefits consultants, and private foundations to help diagnose the dysfunction in the drug supply chain. Next slide. So let's start where we should start, the price. The problem with prescription drug pricing is that there's no such thing as the price. Next slide. There's a lot of different options that you can choose from. I will not explain all of these alphabet soup, but keep in mind that every single one of these acronyms stands for a different price and a different way to calculate price at a variety of layers throughout the distribution system in the drug supply chain. Next slide. And what that means is that drug prices are hidden. And instead of actually being something like you buy at a grocery store where the price is the price, the prices are in fact set by contracts, not necessarily an efficient marketplace. Because of that, because of the lack of objectivity on what price is, that also means that prices are prone to manipulation. Next slide. So let's talk about what's happening with drug prices now that I just told you that the prices don't matter. So what we have here, and this is all publicly available data from our nonprofit 46 Brooklyn Research. You can go on our website and you'll see an actually updated chart in this regard. But what you'll see here, this is from our brand name drug price change box score, where we evaluate every single price change that occurs on a brand name drug dating back to 2010. What you could see here is that the number of annual drug price increases on brand name drugs have been declining each year since 2015. Next slide. This year, however, we're seeing a little bit of a change in trajectory of that trend. More brand drugs are going up in price than years past. 2021 is appearing to alter the trends of eroding numbers with price trends. And in January 2021, we saw the most January increases that we've seen in over a decade. Before you get your pitchforks out, next slide. The sizes of all of those increases are smaller. So while this year is on track to break a trend of declining brand increases since, or the number of brand increases since 2015, what you see here is nuance. And this is what is usually so absent from conversations around drug pricing. All you see are the headlines of so-and-so raised their price, or spending has increased this much, or spend increases decreased this much. We discount all of that and look at the details and the nuance. And so when you look at the nuance, the median price increase is down to 4.9%, which is the lowest amount in a decade. And if you weight price increases, again, these are list prices, and you weight them according to Medicaid drug utilization data, the actual average price increase is also down to 5.3%, which is also the lowest amount in a decade. So the number of increases is up, but the degree of those increases is down. But those are all just list prices. The reality is that list prices are really just a starting point for how price trickles down through the drug supply chain. And if you look at the concessions that are made by drug makers and passed through to state governments in their Medicaid programs, federal programs like the Department of Veterans Affairs, and to insurers and pharmacy benefit managers, you'll actually see that there is a massive amount of disconnect between the real price of a medication and the list price. That delta, as quantified by drug channels, if you don't follow drug channels, I highly recommend, it equals $175 billion in 2019, and that is growing. Next slide. And the reality is that drug maker discounts and rebates are now growing faster than list prices. Let me say that again. List prices are growing, but the degree of discounts and concessions are growing at a more rapid and significant pace than the actual list prices themselves. Next slide. So, are we getting a good deal? It's really hard to know. While I just told you that the discounts are growing, the degree with which those discounts are passed on to the end payer, whether that be a patient or a plan sponsor, is completely up to the middlemen that are collecting those discounts. And because brand drug manufacturer rebates to PBMs, insurers, and now little-known entities called rebate aggregators, because they're confidential and they vary widely from plan to plan, program to program, it's extremely difficult to pin down the actual price being paid. And because government entities also command such large discounts, small payers, small employers, and patients who pay out of pocket end up picking up a disproportionate share of the overall cost of a medication. And because each plan and PBM promote utilization of different drug mixes, apples to apples comparisons of overall net costs is extremely difficult. This inability to objectively determine what a fair price for a medication should be hinders the ability for a true market to emerge to pressure drug supply chain margins and promote quality and efficient spend. Next slide. And I hate to tell you, but everything I just told you earlier essentially means that the prices are fake. Next slide. The list prices for prescription drugs are wildly overinflated relative to their actual cost. PBMs, through their contracts with plan sponsors and governments and pharmacies, use those list prices as the basis for their pricing guarantees. Brand name drugs have high AWPs. In pharmacy, we could call this average wholesale price. For the purpose of this conversation, just think of it as the sticker price. Those AWPs are offset by negotiated rebates and discounts that we just talked about. But generic drugs also have high sticker prices that are derived from brand drugs that in no way reflect the actual prices pharmacies pay to acquire those drugs. In both regards, the real prices of both brand and generic drugs are completely hidden from the plan sponsor and the patient. Next slide. So here's the fallout of these fake prices. If there is a big amount of discounts that drug makers are yielding off of the list price of the drug, it begs the question of who is getting those discounts. And as I said, PBMs, notably, are the entities who receive these discounts and can choose how much of those discounts to pass through to their clients. Because they're able to choose, what that means is they're deploying a strategy called price discrimination, meaning that they might collect, let's just say on average, $100, or let's say a prescription drug costs $100. We have a theoretical example here on the right. Medicaid programs are mandated to get the largest discounts in the marketplace, so they're essentially getting the best deal on a drug. But remember, when somebody gets a best deal, that means everybody else is getting a worse deal. And so what you see here is a breakdown of how this can trickle through the payer sphere. Medicaid getting the best rate, the federal supply schedule or the big four getting a slightly worse rate, a Part D plan sponsor getting a worse rate than that, a large employer getting worse than that, and then a small employer or a patient that is paying out of pocket in a pre-deductible phase, forced to shell out essentially the entire list price of a medication, even though the drug maker has reduced the net price of that medication in an aggregate fashion back to the marketplace. These hidden rebates, some argue that they have their place in the system. I personally despise them because of the complexity that they add to the system. But regardless of whether they're a net good or a net bad, they are the key enabler that allows the drug supply chain to capture the benefits of that drug price discrimination. Next slide. So part of what we do at our firm is analyze drug pricing data for a number of entities, including small employers. Most employers are not allowed to even get access to this type of data. We happen to work with a coalition of employers. We were able to see exactly what they were being charged for prescription drugs and quantify the degree of discounts that they were getting off of brand name medications. So again, the brand drug makers are making these big concessions and rebates back to PBMs. We're analyzing the degree with which a small employer was getting the essentially an average or some sort of reflection of where the marketplace is. This small employer group spent about $110 million on brand name drugs in 2018. We compared their drug utilization data to the federal supply schedule, which is a proxy for the best available commercial price in the market. If they were getting the best deal in the commercial marketplace, they would receive $30 million in rebates. However, that was not the case. They received $5 million in rebates. So essentially, while drug makers had flowed through massive amounts of rebates that would quantify to about a $30 million worth of discount for this type of drug mix, this small employer group only got $5 million, which implies strongly that PBMs and their affiliated insurance companies retained the delta for themselves. Next slide. But as we talk about rebates and as scrutiny increases on what rebates are and how big they are, PBMs have started altering the definition of rebates. My definition of a rebate is every single dime that a drug maker passes through to a PBM. Well, PBMs are now saying rebates are whatever they say they are. And so every dime of the drug maker price concession is now being re-itemized by PBMs as something that isn't a rebate, as a means to hide the amount of money that they're receiving from drug makers, as a means to withhold that from plan sponsors, and frankly, bamboozle them into thinking that they're getting much more of the discounts than they actually should be. Next slide. Here's how the rebate retention game works. We now have a number of entities that have been hatched up overnight, essentially, since growing scrutiny has hit these rebates. And PBMs have now created what's known as a group purchasing organization or rebate aggregators that exist a level above PBMs that are now taking over the rebate negotiations on behalf of the PBM. By moving the rebate negotiation to a layer above the PBM, they're able to then take whatever is left over and then tell their clients that they are passing through 100% of their rebates, when in fact an affiliated entity that now lives over top of them is skimming off the top before it enters the PBM's line of business. What we're also seeing is that in these rebate guarantees, we're seeing less and less emphasis on categorization as a traditional rebate. And as you'll see to the right, these are all the different definitions and terms that now are embedded in PBM contracts that essentially carve out what a rebate is as a means to hide it from their plan sponsors who expect them to pass it through. I'm not going to read all of these, but for the sake of brevity, these are absolutely ridiculous categorizations as a means to finagle their way around transparency disclosures that are now being required by their clients, their employers, and government entities. Next slide. All of that covers the transaction from drug maker to PBM back to plan sponsor. But there is another side of the transaction, which is the one that most patients are actually exposed to, which is the drug maker to wholesaler to pharmacy, and then PBM in the middle facilitating the transaction at the pharmacy counter. So one of the things that PBMs do while they're setting negotiation, when they're negotiating with a drug maker based on what's going to be covered and what isn't, and for what price, on the other end of the transaction, they're negotiating with pharmacies, telling you, the patient, where you can and can't get your medications filled, and then facilitating the transaction by telling the pharmacy, here's how much we're willing to pay for that product. So one of the things that we think of with PBMs is that, okay, they're just in the middle of the transaction facilitating the claim. But as I told you before, many of these PBMs are now creating layers above and underneath them that are outside of their core functionality as a PBM. All the large PBMs actually now own their own pharmacies. So imagine how screwy this is. A plan sponsor hires a PBM to ostensibly control the price of pharmaceuticals that are being dispensed by pharmacies. The conflicts of interest start arising when PBMs profit off the drug at various layers of the channel, including the pharmacies that they own. So one of the things that we did for our employer group that we analyzed was to analyze the degree with which PBMs were taking prescriptions and pushing them to the pharmacies that they own. What we found was that the most expensive drug claims were being steered at a much disproportionate rate to the pharmacies that were owned by the PBM. Next slide. This is occurring in the Medicaid space as well. We did a public records request where we could see the exact same type of data, except for the Florida Medicaid program, where PBMs were successful in taking a disproportionate share of the expensive medications and forcing them or leveraging them to be dispensed at pharmacies owned by that PBM. In each instance with the major health plans in the Florida Medicaid program, it was more expensive for the state when those drugs, the exact same drugs, were dispensed at PBM-owned pharmacies versus non-PBM-owned pharmacies. Next slide. Here's what that looks like on just a more granular level with the drug Humira. Again, the pharmacies are performing ostensibly the same service, whether the pharmacy is owned by the PBM or not. However, in each instance with the major health plans in Florida, it was more expensive when it was dispensed at a PBM-owned pharmacy versus a traditional community pharmacy. Next slide. Those are just the brand drugs. But I want to walk you through the generic drugs, which are supposed to be the drugs that are saving money and making way for those innovative brand name drugs to hopefully provide some cost relief to make way for those great new products coming to market. We analyzed every drug that lost patent exclusivity from 2005 to September 2019. For each drug, 1,247 drugs, we found that the first generic version brought to market had a sticker price that was just a sliver below what the sticker price for the brand name drug was. 77% of newly released generics were launched with a sticker price that was 0 to 15% discount to the brand name medication it was designed to replace. I'll explain why that's important here in a minute. Next slide. So because we use fake prices, and when I say fake prices, I mean the sticker prices, it begs the question of what the real prices are on brand name medications, as we discussed before, but also generics. We did an analysis where we compared the sticker price of a very old generic drug, generic Nexium, 90 count bottle. And if you looked at the AWP or the sticker price of that drug, you would see that it's almost $800 for 90 pills. If you were to actually look at benchmarks that show the real prices of the medications, the prices that pharmacies pay to acquire the drugs, you'll see that the sticker price is 47 times higher than the actual price of that medication, using publicly available data sets known as National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, or a state survey done by the Alabama Medicaid program where they ask pharmacies to submit their acquisition costs to their state. What you can see here is there is a massive disconnect between the sticker price and the real prices of medications. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of how crazy this is, the sticker prices are so disconnected from the real prices of the medications. I thought I would show you an example of how twisted this would look in a purchase where we're used to getting discounts. We all know if we wanted to buy a car or a truck, the sticker price is wildly inflated or somewhat inflated relative to what a fair deal is. Lucky for us, we have the Kelley Blue Book or other types of reference prices that tell us what a reasonable price is for an automobile. If we took the delta between the sticker prices and the real prices of generic drugs and extrapolated that to cars, you would see that trucks would have to, this 2020 Ford F-150 Super Cab Platinum that my wife would never let me buy, would cost over $1 million as a sticker price relative to its true Kelley Blue Book value of $53,000. This is how much delta there is and fat there is in some of these prices. Next slide. So when you're using fake prices, or when PBMs use fake prices in their PBM contracts, and they use it in their methodology to bill a patient or a plan sponsor, what that means is that there's a lot of room to maneuver under that top line price because it's so disconnected from reality. And they're able to come back to patient or plan sponsor and say, look how much money we saved you on all of these drugs. when we all know that the actual prices are fictitious. And because they're proprietary and fictitious, that gives PBMs the ability to take advantage of that transaction. This is exactly what we found in the state of Ohio, where they were paying pharmacies low and then billing a completely different rate back to the state Medicaid programs and pocketing the difference. That difference is what we typically call spread pricing. Next slide. So this is why we started what we do. While we have had the crumb trail of what was happening in our Medicaid program, we didn't have the hard data. And so we used publicly available data to basically get lawmakers in Ohio and the state auditor ginned up to say, we deserve to know what we're buying and how much we're buying it for. Well, when they finally busted open the books of our Medicaid program, they found PBMs taking $244 million in hidden markups off the top of the transactions on primarily generic drugs alone. The PBM spread that they were capturing as this hidden delta over the generic drugs equated to 31.4% of gross generic spending in Ohio Medicaid managed care. Mind you, generic drugs account for 87% of all prescription drug transactions. So they're taking 31.4% of the gross spend on a majority of the medications that are being dispensed. Next slide. Our discussion today is timely because just last week, they announced the first major win in actually recapturing some of this money that was stolen from our Medicaid program in Ohio. Our state auditor that did the audit in the first place was a gentleman by the name of Dave Yost. Dave Yost was promoted by Ohio voters to become our attorney general. So he knew where the bodies were buried, and he was able to actually act as the cop to adjudicate what happened with the drug pricing murder, if you will. Centene, which is actually one of the smaller players in the PBM space, was found to be pocketing more than $11 per prescription under this audit that he did back in 2018. Yost announced that he'll be capturing, or that he's reached a settlement with Centene to pay back $88 million to the state of Ohio, $55 million to Mississippi, and more than $1.1 billion have been set aside by Centene to settle lawsuits and allegations in other states. This is the first and largest settlement in the country secured by a state attorney general, and is just, while it is the first, it is not the last. Next slide. Ohio isn't alone. We did a project in the state of Michigan where we analyzed reimbursement data from over 450 pharmacies in the state of Michigan, and then merged that in with real drug pricing data and cost exposures for the state Medicaid managed care program in Michigan. What you see here with the blue line is the acquisition costs for generic medications distributed through the Medicaid program. The green line represents what the 450 pharmacies were paid on average per prescription. The orange line represents what the state was charged for the exact same type of drugs. And as you can see here, the drug costs are going down. The pharmacy margins are going down. But the gap between the green line and the orange line is a proxy for what the PBMs were taking off the top. And as you can see, they were growing exponentially over time. Next slide. Don't take our word for it. The Florida Medicaid program, after we released our report, later released their own independently done analysis from Milliman. Milliman is far more reputable than 3-Axis Advisors. I'm willing to admit that. But Milliman is really one of the gold standard agencies that look at these types of things on behalf of Medicaid programs. And what they found was that a number of their managed care plans were also being exposed to PBM spread pricing. And in each bucket of prescriptions, whether it was brand non-specialty drugs, brand specialty drugs, generic non-specialty drugs, and generic specialty drugs, in every single category, the plans that allowed PBMs to subjectively skim off the top, all of them were charged significantly more per prescription than plans that did not allow PBMs to subjectively set margins over the top. Next slide. Unsurprisingly, there's been a national backlash against these practices. Maryland has banned spread pricing. CMS has updated new transparency requirements with spread pricing. And large drug pricing packages at the federal level have sought to ban the practice as well. Next slide. And more states are getting into the act. And even small health plans are recognizing that this is a rotten deal even for them. Next slide. But the PBM stock prices haven't tumbled, which means that they're able to find other ways to make their money. In our Florida Medicaid analysis, where we could see 350 million claims worth of data and see what every pharmacy was paid, claim by claim, drug by drug, plan by plan, PBM by PBM, day by day. When you zoom out and look at what happens to drug pricing data, if any chart is etched into your mind, I would have you look at this one. Centene, the company that's being sued in Ohio and just settled for will likely be over $1 billion in alleged overcharges to state Medicaid programs across the country. In 2017, Centene, while they had their own in-house PBM, also relied on CVS Caremark, one of the largest PBM in the marketplace, to help them set prices in the pharmacy marketplace. If CVS Caremark sounds familiar to you, that's because Caremark is the PBM and CVS is obviously the pharmacy company. So you have a PBM that is affiliated with one of the largest drug stores in the country that is able to set prices in the pharmacy marketplace. Well, here's what happened when Centene turned over their price setting to CVS Caremark in the middle of 2017. The data showed that the reported rates of reimbursement to independent pharmacies, as reflected on the orange line, and Publix, which is a regional grocer in Florida, reflected by the green line, all of a sudden fell through the floor. While simultaneously, the reported rates of reimbursement at CVS pharmacies exploded through the roof. Overall, this is just for one drug. This is generic Abilify. It's a mental health medication. But overall, if you look at all generic drugs in the reported margin over acquisition cost, 94% of the margin for all pharmacies was captured by CVS pharmacies, according to the reported data from Florida. Next slide. But as I said earlier, as more and more scrutiny is hitting rebates, they're transitioning. And now more and more scrutiny is hitting spread pricing, PBMs are transitioning again. This chart from Nephron Research shows that the amount of revenue that PBMs are generating on a proportion basis, rebates and spread pricing have been declining over time, making way for increased revenue on specialty pharmacy profits from PBMs, as well as ambiguously defined fees. Next slide. And as I said, all PBMs and health plans now have their own specialty pharmacies. Specialty drugs make up less than 1% of all drug claims, but make up more than 33% of drug spend, and it's almost 50% at this point. So because PBMs own their own pharmacies where they're dispensing these medications, regardless of whether they say they're providing a good deal, their incentives are aligned in such that they have a conflicted interest in controlling costs on medications that they're now profiting off of underneath the PBM business. Next slide. And just like we saw with brand name drugs, we see with generic specialty drugs as well. Our small commercial payers who allowed us to use their data to show what's happening in this system. What you can see on cheap generic drugs, PBM-owned pharmacies are dispensing a very small amount of those medications, only 11%. However, when you get to the expensive generic drug claims, 51% of those claims are being dispensed by pharmacies owned by the PBM. And as you can see, when they're dispensing the drugs, they are paying themselves on average $3,448 in margin per prescription. Bear in mind that a pharmacy on average only needs $10 in margin to break even on a transaction. When PBMs are paying their own pharmacies, they are paying them not $10 in margin per prescription, $3,448 per prescription on the expensive generic specialty medications. Next slide. This is from our Florida Medicaid analysis. This is a breakdown of how PBM-owned pharmacy margins compare to traditional community pharmacies. These are names that you may not have heard of before: Accredo, Perform Specialty, Exactus, Briova, Acaria. These are all large specialty pharmacies that are owned by insurers and PBMs. And as you can see, their margin per prescription on brand name drugs far dwarfs that of brand name drugs dispensed at traditional community pharmacies. Next slide. And it's not just impacting your small pharmacies. This is data from the Milliman report in Florida. This is not our data. This is from the Department of Medicaid in Florida. Walgreens and CVS have about the exact same number of pharmacies in the state of Florida. But as you can see from the Florida Medicaid audit performed by Milliman, while CVS pharmacies filled just about 11 million prescriptions over the same time period as Walgreens, Walgreens only dispensed less than 2 million prescriptions over that time period. That is because CVS and their PBM Caremark are able to put their thumb on the scale and either force or pressure patients to get their prescriptions filled at CVS pharmacies. Next slide. We found this dynamic play out in Ohio. After Ohio banned spread pricing and said PBMs can no longer skim off the top, all of a sudden, pharmacies reported seeing spikes in reimbursement rates on those generic specialty medications. For one drug, generic Gleevec, which is a leukemia drug, pharmacies saw their margins increase by over 1,700% compared to the prices they were paid prior to spread pricing being banned. Well, so these pharmacies were quite happy with the windfall, but what they didn't realize is they were only receiving crumbs off of the table. Because PBMs were steering most of those medications to themselves, while these pharmacies were taking on these little bits of crumbs, PBMs were helping themselves to the buffet because their specialty pharmacies were dispensing a disproportionate share of those prescriptions. These problems continue to persist today, but by no means unique to Ohio and by no means unique to Medicaid programs. Next slide. So here's what we've learned. It's really, really complicated. But the good news is that the PBM's black box is starting to break open. You can advance through. This is a quote from two U.S. senators, Chuck Grassley and Ron Wyden, exact opposites of the spectrum. These two senators have been in charge of the biggest drug pricing investigations that have gone on in Congress over the last few years. And both of them are completely aghast at what they have found within the PBM industry and are actively working to fix it. Next slide. This is just the slide is going to be kind of hard to decipher, but we did an analysis of stock prices. There's no better truth serum than the stock market. And what we did is we compared managed care plans and PBMs to pharmaceutical manufacturers to pharmacies. Now, we didn't include CVS in that analysis because CVS Pharmacy essentially is they make more revenue from their PBM and insurance offerings than they do their PBMs at this point. But if you take them and analyze their stock prices and then compare that to the actual growth in rebates over time, you can actually see that as list prices go up, those that are benefiting the most in this system are managed care plans and PBMs, far dwarfing that of manufacturers and then far dwarfing that of pharmacies. Next slide. This is another way to look at it as well. We looked at the drug channel's gross to net bubble. essentially what the rebates are. The prior slide was looking at the list prices. This is looking at the growth of rebates over time. And as you can see, the green bars are going up over time. That's the rebate pie that's sloshing around the system. And again, you see that managed care and PBMs who bemoan high drug prices, yet are capturing these rebates, their stock market performance is far dwarfing that of other members of the supply chain. Next slide. There's a great quote from Dr. Madeline Feldman, who's a rheumatologist. And I always try to end it with this, because PBMs come in and they say, look, we're here to save you all this money. You know, our job in the drug supply chain is to save money. Their incentives suggest otherwise, but regardless of that, let's just pretend and give them the benefit of the doubt. PBMs claim that manufacturer rebates are actually savings, reducing the cost of drugs by billions of dollars. Given the way the system is geared, to force patients into higher priced medications is akin to saying that a $1,000 dress at 50% off saves more money than a $100 dress with the same 50% reduction. At some point, we can't afford all of these savings. Wonderful. Next slide. And so as I wrap this up, there are a number of things that states and plan sponsors can do to rein in these problems. More and more Medicaid programs are pulling the plug on PBM setting prices in their system by carving out. More Medicaid programs and plan sponsors are requiring full pass-through, telling the PBM, you need to pass through all of these rebates, and requiring full transparency. Prohibiting a PBM to limit their networks or tell a patient that they're forced to use a pharmacy that they didn't choose. More and more states are banning spread pricing, banning gag clauses on pharmacies that tell pharmacists they can't tell a patient how they can save money. We're seeing more states, the state of West Virginia just required all rebates to be passed through back to patients and plan sponsors. We're seeing a growth in reverse auctions. Reverse auctions, and I know pioneered by New Jersey, kudos to you, take these complex drug pricing systems and create apples to apples comparisons so that we could truly evaluate whether or not PBMs are giving us a deal. We're seeing bans on copay accumulators, which I won't get into. We're also seeing fiduciary requirements being talked about, requiring PBMs to act in the interest of patients and plan sponsors. With that, I've already gone probably past my time. I am extremely honored to be with you and chat with you, and I want to thank you for your interest in this, because you know, we all deserve a better system. And look, PBMs aren't the only problem in the drug supply chain. I want to be clear, but they're the only ones that we rely upon to actually give us a deal. And the evidence shows time and time again that they are violating that trust, and in fact, making the problems in the drug supply chain even worse. So thank you very much.
Antonio, thank you very much. And this is Dean Paranicus here. Good morning to everyone. Wow, what a presentation. You know, it's interesting. You give us so much to think about. And I'm reminded a few years ago, I think it was USA Today attempted in one graphic to try to capture the drug pricing system, and it was utterly incomprehensible. But in any event, I am here on behalf of both We Work for Health, of whom I'm proud to be a co-chair along with Debbie, and on behalf of our organization, Healthcare Institute of New Jersey, or HINJ as it's well known. We are the trade association for research-based biopharmaceutical and medical technology companies here in the state, including many of the world's largest. We represent the industry in both Washington and Trenton. And if I could capture and summarize in one statement what HINJ does, we are founded on three pillars: access, innovation, and jobs. Access to ensure that patients have the access to all of the medications and therapies and treatments and cures that our industry continues to develop. Innovation, which is the lifeblood of our industry and requires the right kind of ecosystem and support in order to enable that to flourish. And jobs. The industry, as I'm about to show you, next slide please, is a major player. And in fact, it is the premier industry in New Jersey in terms of its economic impact. New Jersey rightly is known as the medicine chest of the world, and our collective goal is to keep it that way. We are clearly an industry nerve center. with such a significant presence in the state of both the U.S. and foreign companies. Nearly 1,600 life sciences establishments in the state, an $83 billion plus direct and indirect economic impact in 2017, about 14% of the state's GDP. And importantly, over $7.9 billion in New Jersey vendor purchases, meaning with organizations, suppliers of goods and services to the industry in the state. Next slide, please. I mentioned the economic impact. I mentioned the reach. The industry accounts for about 430,000 total jobs that are supported by the industry, both direct and indirect, which is 10.6% of all jobs in the state. And that includes 75,000 direct biopharmaceutical and medical device sector jobs and 245,000 indirect jobs supported by the biopharmaceutical sector. If you could, next slide, please. In terms of New Jersey's leadership, I think this slide is compelling when you see where the state ranks as a leader in all of these categories, whether it's in drug development, for example, for heart disease and stroke medicines, cancer drugs, the fact that we've got an exceptionally strong biopharma cluster, #2 state for biotech strength, #1 state for life sciences manufacturing employees and employed biochemists and biophysics, strong in medical devices, clearly a leader in that NIH funding, and importantly, nearly 800 active clinical trials, generating nearly $900 million of economic impact in the state. Next slide, please. And as you can see from this slide, the state has been, the state's industry has been extremely active in terms of its response to COVID, being active early and continuing on to this day as a leader, whether it's donating medical supplies and existing medicines, making diagnostic products and devices, as well as personal protective equipment available, monetary contributions to hospitals, foundations, and charities, working with government agencies. And of the 120 diagnostic companies that have developed so many COVID-19 in vitro diagnostic tests, that includes many leading global diagnostic companies that have a significant presence here in the state. Now, Antonio talked about the reverse auction. So next slide, please. I'd like to talk about this for a moment in a little bit more detail. Yes, in fact, New Jersey is a leader in this area. And in fact, they had the first in the nation PBM model that other states are considering. And in fact, in this particular case, the state had expected to spend about $8.3 billion on prescription drugs over 3 years ago if they'd stayed in a status quo contract with a PBM. But the state moved in a different direction. So now under the new format, the state generated a projected $1.6 billion in savings in prescription drug costs for the state health benefits programs and for the school employees. In all, the state now estimates it will save more than $2.5 billion because of reverse auctions. And importantly, I'll direct you to the last bullet on that slide. The state also has used that reverse auction technology to conduct PBM oversight, which resulted in additional savings of nearly $46 million in claim processing issues over an 18-month period. So obviously, we are very proud of the fact that New Jersey is a national leader in this area, and certainly it is one of a number of responses, as Antonio enumerated, that should be considered in terms of responding to this. So with that, before I turn it over to questions, I'd like to just refer you to a program that exists in terms of how we've been helping patients access their medications, especially during the pandemic. This is called the Medicine Assistance Tool, which is a web-based platform offered by Pharma that is designed to help provide access to over 950 public and private programs for those who qualify for the program. So I would refer you to the website there, www.mat.org, for additional information about the assistance programs that are available. So with that, I think it's now time for us to segue to questions. We have a few questions lined up. So I'm going to turn it back over to Debbie Hart for the first question.
Thank you, Jean. So, Antonio, just fascinating presentation, which based on your bio, we fully expected. Just, there's so much to unpack there. It's just really incredible. So, so one question, are copay accumulator bans perhaps the first step toward lowering out-of-pocket costs for patients?
Yeah, I think so. I think, copay accumulators are being abused by PBMs and health plans as a way to foist more cost onto the patients. And it's basically the PBM saying, hey, we get rebates, but the patients can't. And I think it's frankly ridiculous. There's a lot of evidence out there showing that out-of-pocket expenditures are growing. And furthermore, that patient abandonment grows with the growing amount of out-of-pocket expense. This is literally, life and death stuff for some patients because they'll forego medications they need to stay alive. I usually don't like coupons, but in general, I mean, they're a Band-Aid on a bad system that is foisting too much cost on patients.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Antonio, you demonstrated that spread between, let me get myself back up here so I could see who I'm talking to. Apologies. There we go. That's not working. Anyway, you talked about the spread between the large pharmacies and the smaller independent pharmacists, but let's talk about that group for a moment. How can they, the independent pharmacists, who often face these spread pricing situations, set up a good faith negotiation with PBMs?
So there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a good faith negotiation. And it's not because all PBMs are bad. It's because they have too much power at this point. 3 PBMs make up, I've seen a number of stats that on the low end say about 75%, on the high end around 85% of the entire PBM marketplace, which means that if you are a patient, you're using insurance, that means that 85% of those transactions up to are being managed by 3 companies. Some of the competitor PBMs will do what we call white label a number of functions from the big 3 as it is. So 85% is actually a very conservative estimate. So think of this from a pharmacy standpoint. Most patients are procuring their medications through insurance, which means pharmacies don't get to set their prices anymore. A pharmacy is basically in a take it or leave it contract. If the patient is paying with insurance, that means the pharmacy is set to negotiate with that PBM. I can tell you, I've sat down with the largest pharmacy chains and a small independent shop. There is no material difference in their negotiating leverage because the PBM really has the providers at their mercy. They can choke off the flow of medications to those pharmacies with just a stroke of a pen. So yes, it's disproportionately felt by independent providers, yes, but it is problematic for all providers, even the big ones.
Okay, that's I guess that's the reality of this marketplace. Let me pivot over for a moment. You cited 2 U.S. senators on this issue, and that's important because what I'd like to get at is, what do you think comprehensive PBM reform looks like at the federal level? We talked about some responses at the state with things like reverse auctions and a lot of the audits that you mentioned, but how do you see things unfolding at the federal level in this realm?
Well, the first thing is we need to pass a bill that gives Congress a spine because they have played pretend for far too long. These are existential issues. They've been diagnosed for years and years. I laugh every time I see, we need a new study commission, looking at these problems. We need to, have the FTC issue an opinion. We already know what's happening in this system, and it is very much broken. The fox is guarding the hen house. And so at the federal level, at a minimum, there are things that they can do to really turn this industry on its head. and that is rebate reform, actually making sure that PBMs aren't profiting off of the discounts that they're getting and passing them through to patients and plan sponsors. Full transparency. Part of the reason that they got away with $244 million is because it was previously hidden. These are all embedded margins in proprietary contracts that are hidden from public view. It took a lot of work to get from that point in 2016, where we first saw the cuts, all the way to here we are in 2021, finally getting some of that money back. If we had full transparency, then those things wouldn't have to take so long and be able to root these problems out, not just for government payers, but when the government learns its lesson, the private sector usually learns those lessons as well. The only other thing that I would mention is, I think that PBMs, we need to have a serious conversation around them having a fiduciary duty back to their plan sponsors and patients, something that they do not have today. So yes, there's a lot that can be done at the federal level. Unfortunately, the federal level is arguably as dysfunctional as the drug supply chain. So, a lot of states are being nimble and taking it upon themselves. And things like reverse auction and some of the policies that we discussed earlier are all ways that they can start nipping at market reform.
Well, certainly, I'm not sure which is more dysfunctional, but we could talk about that for hours. But in any event, we are nearing the completion of our time, I believe. So what I'd like to do is thank Antonio and Debbie. It's been our privilege, Antonio, to host you today. You've done an extraordinary amount of work, an extraordinarily impactful work, I think, in this area. Obviously, much more to be done. This is a major area that will not subside for quite some time. And by the way, if anyone in our listening audience has any additional questions, there will be a follow-up email, and you can submit whatever supplemental questions you may have through that platform. So with that, Terry, I'll turn it back over to you for any closing comments, and thank you all again.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank our two co-chairs, Debbie Hart and Dean Paranikis, for joining us today. And Antonio, thank you so much for sharing such informative presentation to all of our partners and our patient advocates on the webinar today. As Dean mentioned, we will be doing a follow-up email that will have some supporting materials, including some social media posts that you could certainly share with your audience. And if you have any additional questions beyond the ones that were covered today, we're happy to answer them or filter them down to Antonio. So thanks again and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.